I learned exactly how petty homeowner associations could be. When I woke up one freezing February morning in my Phoenix, Arizona home to discover that someone had broken into my garage and stolen every single one of my premium thermal blankets. My name is Frederick Young, and I had moved into the Sagaro Vista community 6 months earlier, thinking I had found the perfect quiet neighborhood to settle down in after my divorce. The houses were neat, the streets were clean, and the monthly HOA fee of $200 seemed reasonable for what they promised. Maintained common areas, security patrols, and a community that looked out for each other. What I didn't know was that the HOA president, a woman named Fletcher, ran the place like her personal fiefdom. The thermal blankets weren't just any blankets. I had invested nearly $3,000 in a collection of 8 high-end thermal blankets after spending years camping and hiking throughout the Southwest. Each one was a specialized piece of gear. Some were emergency thermal blankets made with NASA-grade materials. Others were ultra-lightweight camping blankets that could keep you warm in sub-zero temperatures, and a few were premium wool blends that I used for car camping. My ex-wife thought I was crazy for spending so much on blankets, but they had saved my life more than once during unexpected situations in the backcountry. The most important detail about these blankets, the thing that would eventually save me from complete disaster, was that my mother had sewn my full name into the interior lining of each one. She had done it years ago, insisting that if I was going to spend so much money on camping gear, I needed to make sure it wouldn't get mixed up with someone else's equipment on group trips. I had thought it was overkill at the time, but I had let her do it because it made her happy. The embroidery was subtle, done in white thread on the inside edge of each blanket, reading Frederick Young in her careful handwriting translated to thread. When I discovered the theft that Tuesday morning, I was running late for work at the engineering firm downtown, where I worked as a project manager. I had gone into the garage to grab my gym bag and immediately noticed that the plastic storage bin where I kept my blankets was gone. Not just empty, but completely gone. I stood there in my business casual clothes, staring at the empty shelf, trying to process what I was seeing. My garage door had been closed and locked. I checked it twice. No signs of forced entry. I looked around the rest of the garage, and everything else seemed untouched. My tools were still there, my bicycle was still hanging on the wall, my fishing gear was undisturbed. Whoever had taken the blankets had known exactly what they wanted and where to find it. I called the police non-emergency line and filed a report. Officer Martinez showed up about an hour later, a tired-looking man in his 40s who had probably seen every kind of petty theft Phoenix had to offer. He walked around my garage, took some notes, and asked me the value of the stolen items. "About $3,000 total," I said, showing him the receipts I had kept in my filing cabinet. I was meticulous about documentation, a habit from my engineering work. Officer Martinez whistled low. "That's felony theft territory. Anything over $1,000 is a Class 6 felony in Arizona." "I just want my blankets back," I said. "They have sentimental value, too. My mother embroidered my name inside each one before she passed away last year." He made a note of that detail. "That could help with identification if they turn up. Do you have any idea who might have taken them? Any enemies in the neighborhood?" I thought about it. "Not really. I keep to myself mostly, although the HOA president, Fletcher, has been giving me grief about my landscaping. She says my desert garden doesn't meet community standards." Fletcher from Sagaro Vista HOA. Officer Martinez looked up from his notepad, something shifting in his expression. "I've dealt with her before. She's called the police on residents at least a dozen times in the past year for various complaints. Most of them were completely unfounded. She seems like she takes the rules very seriously, I said diplomatically. That's one way to put it. He handed me a case number. We'll keep an eye out for your blankets. In the meantime, I'd suggest getting a security camera for your garage. After Officer Martinez left, I was 2 hours late for work. I called my boss, explained the situation, and spent the rest of the day distracted, wondering who would want to steal camping blankets. It wasn't like they were easy to fence. They weren't electronics or jewelry. They were specialized outdoor gear with a limited market. That evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. Seguero Vista was a planned community of about 200 homes, all built in the same southwestern style with stucco walls and terracotta roofs. The streets were named after desert plants: Ocotillo Drive, Cala Lane, Palo Verde Way. My house was on Mesquite Street, a quiet cul-de-sac at the edge of the development. As I walked past the community center, I noticed lights on inside. The building was a single-story structure that housed the HOA offices, a small gym, and a meeting room. Through the window, I could see someone moving around. Curious, I walked closer. Karen Fletcher was inside, folding what looked like blankets on one of the tables. My thermal blankets. I felt my heart rate spike. There was no mistaking them. I could see the distinctive silver color of the emergency thermal blankets, the blue and gray pattern of the wool blend camping blankets. They were spread out on the table like she was sorting through them. I tried the door. It was unlocked. I walked in and Karen looked up startled. "Frederick," she said, her hand going to her chest. "You scared me." "What are you doing here?" "Those are my blankets," I said, pointing at the table. "Someone stole them from my garage this morning." Karen's expression shifted from startled to defensive in an instant. "These blankets belong to the HOA. We're preparing for the Community Emergency Preparedness Initiative." "Those are my personal property," I said, walking closer to the table. "They were stolen from my garage today." I filed a police report. "I don't know what you're talking about," Karen said, but her voice had that sharp edge of someone who was lying. "These were donated to the HOA by a community member who wished to remain anonymous." I reached for one of the silver emergency blankets. "Then you won't mind if I check something?" Karen moved to block me, but I was faster. I grabbed the blanket and flipped it open, running my hand along the inside edge until I found the embroidered label. There, in white thread, were the words Frederick Young. "See," I said, holding it up so she could see the embroidery. "My mother sewed my name into all of these. They're mine." Karen's face went through several colors, settling on an angry red. "That doesn't prove anything. Lots of people embroider their names on things." "Then explain how blankets with my name on them ended up in the HOA community center on the same day they were stolen from my garage." I was trying to keep my voice calm, but anger was building in my chest. "I told you they were donated," Karen insisted. "The donor must have bought them from you or something. I never sold these blankets to anyone." I started checking the other blankets, finding my name embroidered in each one. "Every single one has my name in it. Karen, you need to tell me what's going on right now." "I don't need to tell you anything," Karen said, drawing herself up to her full height. She was a woman in her early 50s, with blonde hair that was clearly dyed, and she wore the kind of yoga pants and designer athleisure that screamed, "I have money and I want you to know it." "These blankets are HOA property now. If you have a problem with that, you can file a complaint with the board." "The board that you control," I said. "I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," Karen said. "I'll tell them the same thing I told you. These were donated to the HOA." I pulled out my phone and called the non-emergency number again. While I waited for them to answer, I took photos of the blankets, making sure to capture the embroidered names clearly. Karen watched me with her arms crossed, her jaw set in stubborn defiance. Officer Martinez arrived about 30 minutes later, this time with a partner, Officer Chen. I explained the situation while Karen stood there looking like she was being personally victimized. "Madam, did you take these blankets from Mr. Young's garage?" Officer Martinez asked. "I did not," Karen said firmly. "They were donated to the HOA by an anonymous community member." "Can you provide any documentation of this donation?" Officer Chen asked. She was younger than Martinez, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "We don't require documentation for donations under $500, Karen said. "These blankets are worth about $3,000 total," I said, showing them the receipts on my phone. Officer Chen examined one of the blankets, finding the embroidered name. "These clearly belong to Mr. Young." "Or someone with the same name," Karen said. "Madam, I'm going to need you to come down to the station to answer some questions," Officer Martinez said. "Mr. Young, you're free to take your property." "You can't do this," Karen said, her voice rising. "I'm the HOA president. I have rights." "And Mr. Young has the right to his property," Officer Chen said. "You can either come with us voluntarily or we can arrest you for theft." Karen's face went white. "This is harassment. I'm being targeted because I enforce the HOA rules." "Madam, please," Officer Martinez said, his patience clearly wearing thin. I gathered up my blankets while Karen continued to argue with the officers. They eventually convinced her to come to the station for questioning, though she insisted on driving herself and meeting them there. After they left, I stood alone in the community center, my blankets piled in my arms, trying to understand what had just happened. Why would the HOA president steal my camping blankets? It made no sense. If the HOA wanted emergency blankets for some community initiative, they could have just bought their own. Why risk a felony theft charge over something like this? I carried the blankets back to my house, checking each one carefully to make sure they were all there. All 8 blankets were accounted for, and none of them seemed damaged. I put them in my bedroom this time, not trusting the garage anymore. The next morning, I woke up to find a notice from the HOA taped to my front door. It was a violation notice, stating that my desert garden was not in compliance with community standards, and that I had 30 days to replace it with appropriate landscaping or face fines of $50 per day. I stared at the notice in disbelief. My desert garden was beautiful. I had spent months designing it, carefully selecting native plants like agave, prickly pear cactus, and desert marigolds. It was water efficient, low maintenance, and perfectly suited to the Arizona climate. More importantly, Arizona law specifically protected the right of homeowners to use desert landscaping. This was retaliation. Karen was coming after me because I had called the police on her. I took a photo of the notice and called a lawyer. The attorney, a woman named Sandra Martinez who specialized in HOA disputes, listened to my story and laughed. "Let me guess," she said. "Karen Fletcher. You know her?" I asked. "Every real estate attorney in Phoenix knows Karen Fletcher. She's been sued more times than I can count." "The woman is a nightmare." Sandra's voice was cheerful despite the subject matter. "The good news is that Arizona has very strong laws protecting homeowners from HOA overreach. The better news is that your desert garden is almost certainly protected under state law." "So what do I do?" I asked. "First, don't change your landscaping. Second, document everything. Take photos, save all correspondence, keep a detailed log of every interaction with the HOA. Third, Let me send them a letter explaining that they're violating state law. Sandra paused. And fourth, you might want to consider filing a civil suit for harassment, especially given the theft incident. Will that be expensive? I asked, thinking about my budget. It could be, but if we win, the HOA has to pay your legal fees. That's part of Arizona HOA law. They can't just harass homeowners without consequences. Sandra sounded confident. Let me send them the letter first. Sometimes that's enough to make them back down. Over the next few days, things escalated. Karen apparently didn't appreciate the lawyer's letter. I started receiving HOA violation notices almost daily. My house number wasn't reflective enough. My mailbox was the wrong shade of brown. My garbage cans were visible from the street for more than 2 hours after pickup. Each violation came with the threat of daily fines. I documented everything, just as Sandra had instructed. I took photos with timestamps, saved every email, kept every piece of paper the HOA sent me. I also installed security cameras around my property, including one pointing at my garage door. The cameras proved to be a smart investment. 3 days after I installed them, they caught Karen Fletcher trying to enter my garage at 2 in the morning. I was asleep when my phone buzzed with the motion alert. I pulled up the camera app and watched in real time as Karen, dressed in dark clothes, tried to open my garage door with what looked like a universal remote. When that didn't work, she tried the side door. Fortunately, I had installed a deadbolt after the theft. I called 911 this time, not the non-emergency line. Someone is trying to break into my garage right now. The dispatcher asked me to stay inside and keep away from the windows. 2 patrol cars arrived within 5 minutes, their lights off. I watched through my phone as the officers approached Karen, who was still trying to get into my garage. Through my bedroom window, I could hear her voice rising in protest. I'm the HOA president. I have the right to inspect properties for code violations. At 2 in the morning, madam. That sounded like Officer Martinez. I received a complaint about noise coming from this garage. I was investigating. I went downstairs and opened my front door. Officer Martinez saw me and waved me over. Mr. Young, did you give permission for anyone to enter your garage? He asked. Absolutely not, I said, and I haven't been making any noise. I was asleep. Karen glared at me. You're violating multiple HOA codes. I have the authority to investigate violations. Not by breaking and entering, Officer Chen said. She had arrived in the 2nd patrol car. Madam, I'm going to need to see some identification. What followed was a surreal conversation where Karen insisted that, as HOA president, she had special legal authority to access any property in the community. The officers explained repeatedly that this was not how property law worked. Eventually, they arrested her for attempted burglary and violating the restraining order I didn't even know had been issued after the theft incident. As they put her in the patrol car, Karen shouted at me, "You're going to regret this, Frederick. I'll make sure you're kicked out of this community." Madam, you need to stop talking, Officer Chen said, not unkindly. After they left, I couldn't get back to sleep. I sat in my living room, watching the security camera footage over and over, trying to understand Karen's obsession with my property. It had to be about more than just HOA rules. Nobody risked arrest over landscaping disputes. The next morning, I called Sandra and sent her the security footage. She called me back within an hour, and she sounded excited. Frederick, this is exactly what we need. Karen Fletcher has crossed so many lines that we can go after her personally now, not just the HOA. Sandra was practically gleeful. I'm going to file for an emergency restraining order and a civil suit for harassment, stalking, and emotional distress. Will that actually work? I asked. With this footage? Absolutely. And here's the thing, once we establish a pattern of harassment, we can investigate all her other actions as HOA president. I'm willing to bet she's been abusing her position for years. Sandra paused. How would you feel about talking to some of your neighbors? I'd like to know if you're the only one she's been targeting. I spent that afternoon knocking on doors. What I discovered was shocking. Karen Fletcher had been terrorizing the entire community for the past 3 years. She had fined families for children's toys left in yards. She had threatened to foreclose on homes over minor violations. She had even tried to ban one family from using their pool because she claimed the children were too loud. An elderly couple on Palo Verde Way, the Hendersons, told me that Karen had fined them $5,000 for painting their house the wrong shade of beige. They had paid it because they were scared of losing their home. "We're on a fixed income," Mrs. Henderson said, tears in her eyes. "We couldn't afford to fight her." A single mother on Cala Lane, Maria Santos, said Karen had called Child Protective Services on her because her kids played in the front yard after 6 p.m., claiming it was a public disturbance. The CPS investigation had found nothing wrong, but Maria said the experience had been traumatic. By the end of the day, I had statements from 15 families, all documenting various abuses by Karen Fletcher. I compiled everything into a document and sent it to Sandra. "This is bigger than I thought," Sandra said when she called me back. "Frederick, I think we need to call a special HOA meeting and try to remove her from the board entirely." According to the HOA bylaws, which Sandra had obtained, any homeowner could call for a special meeting if they gathered signatures from 20% of the community. With 200 homes, that meant I needed 40 signatures. Given what I had learned that afternoon, I figured that wouldn't be difficult. It took me 3 days to gather 60 signatures. People were eager to sign. Some had horror stories about Karen that made my situation look minor. One man, Robert Chen, told me that Karen had tried to fine him for having solar panels on his roof, claiming they were aesthetically inappropriate. When he pointed out that Arizona law protected solar panel installation, she had retaliated by claiming his air conditioning unit was too loud and needed to be replaced at his expense. The special meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community center. Sandra advised me to be prepared for Karen to fight back. "She's not going to go quietly," Sandra said. "People like her see the HOA as their personal kingdom. Losing that power will feel like a personal attack." Sandra was right. In the days leading up to the meeting, Karen sent out a mass email to all homeowners claiming that I was a troublemaker who was trying to destroy the community. She accused me of various violations, some of which were completely made up. She claimed I was running a business out of my home, which was false. She said I was storing hazardous materials, which was absurd. She even claimed that I was harassing her. The email campaign might have worked, except that too many people had their own Karen Fletcher horror stories. Instead of turning people against me, her email seemed to galvanize support for the special meeting on Tuesday evening. The community center was packed. Nearly every seat was filled, and people were standing along the walls. I had never seen so many of my neighbors in one place. The energy in the room was tense, expectant. Karen sat at the front table with the other board members, Vice President Donald Morrison and Secretary Patricia Webb. Both of them looked uncomfortable. I had spoken with them earlier in the week, and both had admitted that they were aware of Karen's behavior but felt powerless to stop her. Sandra stood with me near the back of the room. "Remember, stay calm. Let the facts speak for themselves." The meeting began with Karen trying to maintain control. This special meeting was called under false pretenses, she said, her voice sharp. The accusations against me are baseless and defamatory. I stood up. I'd like to present evidence of HOA president misconduct. You're out of order, Karen snapped. Actually, he's not, Sandra said, stepping forward. Under Arizona revised statutes and your own bylaws, any homeowner has the right to present evidence at a special meeting. I'm Sandra Martinez, and I'm representing Mr. Young and several other homeowners in this community. The presence of a lawyer seemed to shift the energy in the room. Karen's face went pale. Sandra had prepared a presentation. She connected her laptop to the projector and began walking through the evidence. The security footage of Karen trying to break into my garage, the theft of the thermal blankets, the documentation of excessive fines against multiple families, the pattern of harassment and retaliation. As the evidence mounted, people in the audience began speaking up, sharing their own experiences. Mr. Henderson stood up, his voice shaking, and described how Karen had financially devastated them with bogus fines. Maria Santos talked about the trauma of the false CPS report. Robert Chen explained how Karen had tried to force him to remove his legally protected solar panels. Karen tried to defend herself. I was just enforcing the rules. That's my job as president. Your job is to serve the community, not terrorize it, Sandra said. And you certainly don't have the authority to steal personal property or attempt to break into people's homes. Those blankets were needed for community emergency preparedness, Karen insisted. Then why did you take them without asking? Why did you lie about them being donated? And why did you try to break into Mr. Young's garage 3 days after he recovered them? Sandra's voice was calm but firm. Karen had no good answer for that. She sputtered for a moment, then sat down, her arms crossed defensively. The vote to remove her from the board was nearly unanimous. Only 3 people voted against the measure, and I suspected they were her friends. Donald Morrison was voted in as interim president, and Patricia Webb agreed to stay on as secretary. But the meeting wasn't over. Sandra stood up again. There's also the matter of the illegal fines that have been collected over the past 3 years. Under Arizona law, HOA fines must be reasonable and clearly tied to actual violations. Many of the fines that Miss Fletcher imposed were neither reasonable nor legitimate. The HOA has a legal obligation to refund those fines. This caused an uproar. People started shouting questions. How much money were we talking about? Would everyone get refunds? What about foreclosures that Karen had threatened? Donald Morrison looked overwhelmed. I'll need to review the financial records. I don't even know where to start. I can help with that, said a voice from the back. A man I didn't recognize stood up. I'm Arthur Palmer. I'm a forensic accountant and I live on Ocotillo Drive. If the board authorizes it, I'd be willing to audit the HOA finances pro bono. The board voted unanimously to accept Arthur's offer. The meeting finally ended after nearly 3 hours, with Karen stalking out in fury and most of the other homeowners looking relieved but exhausted. Over the next few weeks, Arthur Palmer's audit revealed shocking information. Karen Fletcher had embezzled over $80,000 from the HOA over 3 years. She had been imposing fines, collecting the money, and then pocketing a significant portion of it. She had also been paying herself an unauthorized salary of $2,000 per month, claiming it was for administrative expenses. The HOA board filed a police report, and the case was turned over to the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Sarah Williams, who took over the investigation, told me that cases like this were more common than people thought. HOA fraud is a big problem, she said. People get into these positions of minor authority and they think they are above the law. They start small, maybe taking a little money here and there, and then it escalates. Karen was arrested and charged with theft, embezzlement, fraud, and attempted burglary. The district attorney's office decided to prosecute aggressively because of the number of victims and the total amount involved. With over $80,000 stolen, this was serious felony territory. The legal process took months. I had to testify at the preliminary hearing, describing the theft of my thermal blankets and Karen's attempted break-in. It was strange sitting in a courtroom, telling a judge about camping blankets with my name embroidered inside. Karen's lawyer tried to argue that she had been confused about what property belonged to the HOA versus what belonged to individuals. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jennifer Lopez, which she joked about constantly, tore that argument apart. So your client was confused about whether blankets with someone else's name embroidered on them belonged to that person? Jennifer asked sarcastically. That seems like a pretty fundamental confusion about property ownership. The judge, a stern man named Harold Stevens, didn't seem impressed with Karen's defense. Miss Fletcher, you held a position of trust in your community. You abused that trust in multiple ways. You stole from your neighbors. You harassed them. You attempted to break into their homes. These are not the actions of someone who was simply confused about HOA rules. Karen was eventually convicted on multiple counts. Judge Stevens sentenced her to 4 years in prison, though she would be eligible for parole after 2 years. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA and to the individual homeowners she had fined illegally. The Hendersons got their $5,000 back. Maria Santos received compensation for the emotional distress of the false CPS report. 15 other families received refunds for improper fines. In total, the court ordered Karen to pay back nearly $90,000. She'll probably never be able to pay all of it, Sandra told me, but at least she's being held accountable. With Karen gone, the HOA underwent a complete transformation. Donald Morrison, as the new president, worked with Sandra to rewrite the bylaws, adding protections for homeowners and limiting the board's authority. Fines were capped at reasonable amounts. A grievance process was established so homeowners could appeal violations. And most importantly, the board had to provide detailed financial reports every quarter, audited by an independent accountant. My desert garden was officially recognized as compliant with all community standards. In fact, the new board encouraged other homeowners to consider water-efficient landscaping. Several of my neighbors asked for advice on creating their own desert gardens. Life in Seguero Vista became peaceful. People actually started attending HOA meetings because they weren't terrified of being fined anymore. The community center hosted movie nights and potlucks. The pool reopened without the ridiculous noise restrictions Karen had imposed. I kept my thermal blankets in a climate-controlled storage unit after everything that happened. It seemed safer than keeping them at home. Every time I looked at them, I thought about my mother and her insistence on embroidering my name inside. She had saved me from losing $3,000 worth of gear and had inadvertently helped bring down a corrupt HOA president. About a year after Karen's conviction, I was at the community center for a neighborhood barbecue when Patricia Webb approached me. She was carrying a folder. "Frederick, I wanted to show you something," she said. "We've been going through all the old HOA records trying to understand how Karen got away with this for so long." She opened the folder and showed me a series of complaints that previous homeowners had filed against Karen, going back almost to the beginning of her tenure as president. There were dozens of them, all describing behavior similar to what I had experienced: harassment, excessive fines, retaliation. "Why didn't anyone stop her?" I asked. "She was good at isolating people," Patricia said. "Each homeowner thought they were the only one having problems, and she had a way of making people feel like they were the problem, not her. It took someone like you, someone willing to stand up and talk to the other neighbors, to reveal the full pattern." "I just wanted my blankets back," I said. Patricia laughed. "Well, your blankets ended up saving this entire community. The barbecue was pleasant." I talked with the Hendersons, who looked healthier and less stressed than when I had first met them. Maria Santos's kids were running around with other children, playing without fear of someone calling the authorities on them. Robert Chen showed me photos of his solar panel installation, which was saving him hundreds of dollars a month on electricity. As the sun set over the Sonoran Desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I felt something I hadn't felt since moving to Sagaro Vista: genuine community. These weren't just people who happened to live near me. They were neighbors who had been through something difficult together and had come out stronger on the other side. My phone buzzed with a text from Sandra. "Just heard from the DA's office. Karen's parole hearing was denied. She'll serve at least another year." I didn't feel any satisfaction from that news, just a sense of closure. Karen Fletcher had created her own consequences through her actions. She had taken something that should have been about building community and twisted it into a tool for personal power and profit. I texted back, "Thanks for letting me know. Couldn't have done any of this without you." Sandra replied, "You gave people the courage to speak up. That's worth more than any legal strategy." Later that evening, I drove out to one of my favorite camping spots in the Superstition Mountains, about an hour east of Phoenix. I set up a simple camp with my tent and a campfire. And I brought one of my thermal blankets, the silver emergency one that had been the first piece of evidence in the case against Karen. Sitting by the fire, wrapped in the blanket with my name embroidered inside, I thought about how small actions could have unexpected consequences. My mother sewing my name into blankets had seemed like such a minor thing at the time. But that simple act of care had created an unbreakable chain of evidence that had protected not just my property, but an entire community. I thought about the path that had led me to this point. The divorce that had brought me to Sagaro Vista. The decision to keep my camping gear organized in the garage. The morning I had discovered the theft. Each moment had seemed random at the time, but together they had formed a story with meaning. The stars came out, brilliant and clear in the desert sky. Out here, away from the city lights, you could see thousands of them. It was humbling and peaceful at the same time. All the drama with Karen, the legal battles, the community meetings, they all seemed small compared to the vast indifference of the universe. But they weren't small to the Hendersons, who could now afford their medications because they weren't paying illegal fines. They weren't small to Maria Santos, who could let her children play outside without fear. They weren't small to all the families who had been living under Karen's tyranny, thinking they had no choice but to accept it. Sometimes the most important battles were the small ones, fought by ordinary people who just wanted to live their lives in peace. I stayed at the campsite through the weekend, hiking during the days and reading by firelight in the evenings. It was the first time I had really relaxed since moving to Arizona. The stress of the past months, the theft, the harassment, the legal proceedings melted away in the quiet of the desert. When I drove back to Sagaro Vista on Sunday evening, I felt renewed. My house looked welcoming in the twilight, my desert garden alive with the subtle colors of native plants. This was home now, truly home, in a way it hadn't been before. The following week, Donald Morrison called an HOA meeting to discuss using some of the recovered funds to improve community amenities. The embezzled money that Karen had been ordered to repay was being collected through a garnishment of her prison wages and a lien on her property, which had been put up for sale. It would take years to recover it all, but the HOA's insurance policy had covered a significant portion of the loss. "We have about $30,000 available for community improvements," Donald said at the meeting. "I'd like to hear suggestions from homeowners about how we should spend it." People proposed all sorts of ideas: upgrading the community center gym equipment, replanting the common areas with native desert plants, installing better lighting along the walking paths, creating a dog park. I raised my hand. What about a community emergency preparedness program? We could buy emergency supplies, organize training, create a response plan for things like heat waves or dust storms. There was a murmur of approval around the room. Arizona had its share of natural disasters: extreme heat, flash floods, haboobs. Being prepared made sense. "We could get actual emergency supplies this time," someone joked, "instead of stolen camping blankets." Everyone laughed, including me. It felt good to be able to laugh about it. The board voted to allocate $10,000 to emergency preparedness, with the rest split between other community improvements. They asked me to head up the Emergency Preparedness Committee, given my background in camping and outdoor survival. Over the next few months, I worked with a group of volunteers to create a comprehensive program. We bought emergency supplies, water storage containers, first aid kits, emergency food supplies, battery-powered radios. We organized training sessions with the Phoenix Fire Department on heat safety and emergency response. We created a phone tree so neighbors could check on each other during extreme weather events. And yes, we bought thermal blankets. Commercial emergency blankets in bulk, with Sagaro Vista HOA clearly labeled on them. I made sure everyone on the committee knew the story of my stolen blankets and why clear labeling was important. The program was a success. When a major heat wave hit Phoenix that summer, with temperatures reaching 120 degrees, our phone tree helped us identify and assist several elderly residents who needed help. When a powerful monsoon storm knocked out power to part of the neighborhood, people knew where the emergency supplies were stored and how to use them. The local news even did a story about our program, highlighting it as an example of effective community organizing. During the interview, the reporter asked me how I had gotten involved in community leadership. "It started with someone stealing my camping blankets," I said, and then explained the whole story. The reporter loved it. The piece aired during prime time, and suddenly, I was getting calls from other HOAs around Phoenix asking for advice on setting up similar programs. Sandra thought it was hilarious. "You've become the accidental face of HOA reform," she said. "I'm getting calls too from homeowners who want help dealing with abusive board members. They all mention your story." "I just wanted my blankets back," I said again. It was becoming my catchphrase. "Sometimes that's how change starts," Sandra said. One person standing up for something small and discovering it was connected to something much bigger. Karen Fletcher's house eventually sold. The new owners, a young couple named Tim and Rebecca Morrison, no relation to Donald, were thrilled to be part of what they called the famous blanket community. They had read about our story online and had specifically looked for homes in Sagaro Vista. "We wanted to live somewhere with an active, engaged HOA," Tim said when I met them. "Not the scary kind, but the kind that actually helps people." "We're working on being that kind," I said. As the first anniversary of Karen's conviction approached, the community decided to have a celebration. Not of her conviction specifically, but of the transformation of Sagaro Vista. We called it Community Appreciation Day. The event took place on a Saturday in March when the weather in Phoenix was perfect. Mid-70s, sunny with a light breeze. We closed down Mesquite Street and set up tables and canopies. People brought food to share. Kids played in the street, drawing with sidewalk chalk. Someone set up a volleyball net. The Hendersons brought their famous potato salad. Maria Santos made incredible tamales. Robert Chen grilled hamburgers and hot dogs. I contributed Dutch oven cobbler, made using techniques I had learned camping, which was a huge hit. At one point, Donald Morrison called for everyone's attention. I want to say a few words about this past year. We went through something difficult together. We discovered that our community had problems, serious problems. But instead of ignoring them or accepting them, we faced them. We stood together, and we made things better. People applauded. Donald continued. I especially want to thank Frederick Young, who had the courage to stand up when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Frederick, would you come up here? I reluctantly walked to where Donald was standing. He handed me a plaque that read, "In appreciation for your leadership and courage, Sagaro Vista HOA." I really just wanted my blankets back, I said, and everyone laughed. You got your blankets back, Donald said, and you gave us our community back. Thank you. More applause. I felt embarrassed and proud at the same time. I hadn't set out to be a community leader or an HOA reformer. I had just been a guy who had his camping gear stolen and refused to let it go. As the celebration continued into the evening, I found myself talking with Arthur Palmer, the forensic accountant who had uncovered the extent of Karen's embezzlement. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "When you volunteered to audit the HOA finances, did you already suspect something was wrong?" Arthur nodded. I had received a few questionable fines over the years, nothing as extreme as what the Hendersons went through, but enough to make me suspicious. When Karen was removed from the board, I saw an opportunity to find out the truth. "What made you want to do it pro bono?" I asked. "Because this is my community," Arthur said simply. I could have charged the HOA thousands of dollars for that audit, but that money would have come from all of us, as homeowners. It seemed wrong to profit from exposing someone who had been stealing from my neighbors. That attitude seemed to sum up what Sagaro Vista had become. People looking out for each other, contributing what they could, building something better together. As I drove home that night, my car full of leftover cobbler and borrowed folding chairs, I passed by Karen's old house. The new owners had painted it a cheerful yellow, a color that probably would have given Karen an aneurysm. They had also planted a front yard full of native plants, similar to my desert garden. Change was possible. Communities could heal. And sometimes, it started with something as simple as refusing to accept that your camping blankets were gone forever. I parked in my driveway and carried the chairs into the garage, the same garage where this whole story had begun. My thermal blankets were still in the storage unit, but I had created new memories here. Good memories of a community coming together. My phone rang. It was my sister, Emily, calling from Seattle. "Hey, I just saw your interview online, the one about the HOA thing. That was you." "Yeah, that was me," I said. "Mom would have been so proud," Emily said. "Not just about stopping that awful woman, but about bringing people together. That was always important to her." "I keep thinking about those embroidered names," I said. "If she hadn't done that, I never would have been able to prove the blankets were mine." "Mom always said the small things mattered," Emily said. She was right. After we hung up, I sat in my living room for a while, thinking about my mother. She had passed away just 2 years ago before I had moved to Arizona. She would have loved Sagaro Vista, would have been out at every community event, probably would have joined the Emergency Preparedness Committee. In a way, she was still here. Her careful stitching, her insistence on labeling things properly, her belief that details mattered, all of that had shaped what happened. She had given me a gift without knowing it, a gift that had ended up protecting dozens of families. I pulled out one of the few photos I had of my mother and me together. We were at a campground in Colorado, standing in front of my tent. She was holding one of the thermal blankets, the blue and gray wool blend, examining it with approval. I had just bought it, and she had asked to borrow it to embroider my name inside. Just in case, she had said. You never know when you might need to prove something is yours. She had been more right than she could have imagined. The next few years passed peacefully in Sagaro Vista. The HOA continued to function well under Donald Morrison's leadership. We had normal meetings about normal things, maintaining the common areas, organizing social events, discussing community safety. No drama, no harassment, no stolen property. I continued to lead the Emergency Preparedness Committee. We ran drills, updated our supplies, and actually used the program several times during weather emergencies. Other HOAs around Phoenix adopted similar programs, often reaching out to me for advice. My desert garden flourished. The agave plants grew tall and proud. The prickly pear cactus bloomed with brilliant yellow flowers every spring. The desert marigolds attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. Neighbors walking by would stop to admire it and ask questions about water-efficient landscaping. I started dating someone I met at a community event, a teacher named Rachel Davis who lived 3 streets over. She had her own Karen Fletcher stories, though less dramatic than mine. Rachel thought the whole blanket saga was hilarious and romantic at the same time. Your mom embroidered your name into your camping gear, she said. That's the most wholesome thing I've ever heard. She was a practical woman, I said. She was a mother who loved her son, Rachel corrected. There's a difference, Rachel was right. The embroidery hadn't just been about practicality. It had been about care, about my mother wanting to protect me even in small ways. That care had rippled outward in ways neither of us could have predicted, protecting not just me but an entire community. Karen Fletcher was released from prison after serving 2.5 years. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved to Tucson, far away from Phoenix, and the community she had terrorized. She was reportedly working a retail job and living in a small apartment, still paying off the restitution she owed. I felt a complicated mix of emotions when I heard that. Part of me was satisfied that justice had been served. Part of me felt sorry for her, for the way she had destroyed her own life through greed and the abuse of power. And part of me was just glad she was gone and that we could all move on. Donald Morrison's term as HOA president eventually ended, and Patricia Webb was elected to replace him. She ran on a platform of continuing the reforms that had been implemented and maintaining the community-focused approach that had replaced Karen's tyranny. She won in a landslide. At Patricia's first meeting as president, she made a point of acknowledging the journey the community had been on. We've learned that an HOA should serve its homeowners, not rule over them. We've learned that transparency and accountability matter. And we've learned that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they stand up for what's right. She looked directly at me when she said that last part. I nodded in acknowledgement. Life continued. Seasons changed. The brutal Phoenix summers gave way to mild winters. The community grew stronger. New families moved in, drawn by the reputation of Sagaro Vista as a well-managed, friendly neighborhood. Old families stayed, no longer afraid of being driven out by unreasonable fines or harassment. I proposed to Rachel on a camping trip to the Grand Canyon, with a thermal blanket spread out under the stars. She said yes. We got married in a ceremony at the Sagaro Vista Community Center, with half the neighborhood in attendance. The Hendersons gave us a beautiful quilt. Maria Santos made the wedding cake. Arthur Palmer officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. It was perfect. Not fancy or expensive, but full of love and community. The kind of wedding that could only happen when people genuinely cared about each other. For our honeymoon, Rachel and I went on a 2-week camping trip through the national parks of Utah. Zion, Bryce Canyon, Capitol Reef, Canyonlands, Arches. I brought all my thermal blankets, each one still bearing my mother's careful embroidery. Rachel thought it was sweet that I was so sentimental about camping gear. They're not just camping gear, I said. They're part of our story. The story of how HOA Karen tried to steal your blankets and ended up going to prison, Rachel teased. The story of how caring about details matters, I corrected. The story of how small acts of love can have big consequences. The story of how standing up for yourself can help other people too. Rachel kissed me. You're right. That's a better story. We spent our nights in those parks wrapped in the thermal blankets, watching meteor showers and listening to the sounds of the desert. We talked about our future, where we wanted to travel, whether we wanted kids, how we wanted to contribute to our community. We made plans and dreamed dreams. And every time I looked at the embroidered name inside those blankets, I thought about my mother and felt grateful. Grateful for her foresight, her care, her belief in doing things properly. Grateful for the chain of events that her simple act of embroidery had set in motion. When we got back to Sagaro Vista, tanned and happy, there was a surprise waiting for us. The community had installed a new sign at the entrance to the neighborhood. It was tastefully done in desert colors, with the words Sagaro Vista, a community that cares. We voted on it while you were gone, Patricia Webb explained. It seemed appropriate. It was appropriate. Sagaro Vista had become exactly that, a community that cared. Not because of any grand design or master plan, but because people had decided that caring about each other mattered more than following arbitrary rules or consolidating personal power. The sign also served as a reminder. Future HOA boards would see it and remember what the community stood for. Future homeowners would see it and know what kind of neighborhood they were joining. It was a promise and a commitment, carved in stone and placed where everyone could see it. Years passed. Rachel and I bought a bigger house in the same neighborhood, one with room for the family we were planning. I kept my camping gear in the new garage, still organized in the same plastic bins, still with the embroidered names inside. The thermal blankets had become family heirlooms of a sort, objects with history and meaning. When Rachel became pregnant with our first child, we talked about names. If it was a boy, we considered naming him Frederick Jr. If it was a girl, we thought about Alina after my mother. What will you tell our kids about all this? Rachel asked one evening, her hand on her growing belly. I'll tell them the truth, I said. That their grandmother was a wise woman who believed in doing things right. That small acts of care can change the world. That standing up for yourself and others matters. And that sometimes the most important battles are fought over camping blankets. Rachel laughed. They're going to think we're crazy. Maybe, I agreed. But they'll also know that they come from people who care about community, who stand up against injustice, and who believe that details matter. Our daughter was born in the spring, and we named her Alina Rachel Young. She was perfect. When we brought her home from the hospital, the Sagaro Vista community threw us a welcome party. People we barely knew brought gifts and food. The Hendersons gave us hand-knitted baby blankets. Maria Santos brought a year's worth of frozen meals. Arthur Palmer set up a college fund in Alina's name. This was what community looked like. Not rules and fines and fear, but care and support and love. As I held my daughter and looked around at all these people who had become so important in my life, I thought about the strange path that had brought us here. A divorce, a move, a theft, a confrontation. Each moment had seemed difficult or random at the time, but together they had woven into something beautiful. Alina grew as babies do. She learned to crawl, then walk, then run. She played in the front yard without anyone calling the authorities. She made friends with other kids in the neighborhood. She was growing up in a community that valued her, that would look out for her, that would teach her what it meant to care about others. One day, when Alina was about 3 years old, she found the storage bin with my thermal blankets. She pulled them out one by one, fascinated by the different colors and textures. "What's this?" she asked, pointing at the embroidered name inside one of them. "That's your daddy's name," Rachel said. "Your grandmother put it there a long time ago." "Why?" Alina asked, as 3-year-olds do. "Because she loved your daddy and wanted to make sure his things didn't get lost," Rachel explained. Alina thought about this seriously. "Can you put my name in my blanket too?" Rachel and I looked at each other and smiled. "Of course we can, sweetheart." That evening, Rachel got out her sewing kit and carefully embroidered Alina Rachel Young into the edge of Alina's favorite blanket. It took her several hours, and her stitching wasn't quite as neat as my mother's had been, but it was done with the same love and care. "There," Rachel said, showing Alina the finished embroidery. "Now everyone will know this blanket belongs to you." Alina hugged the blanket tight, just like Grandma Alina did for Daddy. "Just like that," I said, feeling a lump in my throat. The tradition continued. When our son was born 2 years later, we named him David Frederick Young, and Rachel embroidered his name into his baby blanket. Both kids grew up understanding that details mattered, that taking care of your things was important, and that small acts of love could have lasting impact. They also grew up hearing the story of the stolen thermal blankets. As they got older, they loved hearing about how Grandma Alina's embroidery had helped catch a bad person, and how their daddy had stood up to someone who was being mean to the whole neighborhood. "You were a hero, Daddy," Alina said once, when she was about 7. "I wasn't a hero," I corrected gently. "I was just someone who refused to accept that something wrong was right. The real heroes were all the neighbors who stood together and decided to make things better." "But you started it," David pointed out. He was 5 and very literal-minded. "Sometimes that's all it takes," Rachel said. "Someone willing to take the first step." Sagaro Vista continued to thrive. The HOA remained functional and community-focused. The Emergency Preparedness Program became a model for other neighborhoods. The desert garden spread throughout the community, making the neighborhood a showcase for water-efficient landscaping. Property values rose, not because of strict enforcement of arbitrary rules, but because people genuinely wanted to live in a caring, well-managed community. Sometimes, late at night, I would take out one of the thermal blankets and run my fingers over the embroidered name. Frederick Young in careful white stitches, made by my mother's hands years ago. It was such a simple thing, really, just thread and fabric, but it had changed everything. It had proven ownership when someone tried to steal from me. It had provided evidence that led to justice for an entire community. It had become a symbol of the importance of care and attention to detail. And it had started a family tradition that would be passed down to my children and, someday, to their children. My mother never knew any of this would happen. She just embroidered names into blankets because she thought it was the right thing to do. But that was enough. That had always been enough. The small things matter. The details matter. Taking the time to do things right matters. These were the lessons I had learned, the lessons I was passing on to my children, the lessons that had transformed a neighborhood and exposed corruption and built community, all because of some camping blankets and a mother's careful stitching, all because someone cared enough to take the time, all because when something wrong happened, people decided to make it right. These days, when I tell the story of the HOA and the thermal blankets, people often ask me if I'm still angry at Karen Fletcher. The truth is, I'm not. I feel sorry for her, for the choices she made that destroyed her life and hurt so many people. But I'm not angry. What I feel instead is grateful. Grateful for the community that came together. Grateful for the legal system that held her accountable. Grateful for the neighbors who became friends. Grateful for my mother and her belief in doing things properly. Grateful for the whole strange journey that started with a theft and ended with a stronger, better community. And I'm grateful for the thermal blankets themselves, still carefully stored, still bearing my embroidered name. They're just objects, but they represent something larger: the power of care, the importance of details, and the possibility of justice when people stand together. Someday, when Alina and David are older, those blankets will be passed down to them. And they'll pass them down to their children, along with the story of how a simple act of embroidery changed everything. The story will be told and retold, growing and changing with each generation, but the core truth will remain: small acts of love matter. Standing up for what's right matters. Community matters. Details matter. These truths don't change, no matter how much time passes or how different the world becomes. They are eternal, fundamental, as lasting as white thread stitched carefully into fabric, as enduring as a mother's love for her son. And that, in the end, is the real story. Not about theft or justice or HOA reform, though those are all part of it. The real story is about how care echoes forward through time, touching lives and changing communities in ways we can never fully predict or understand. It's about how the things we do, even the small things, matter more than we know. That's what I learned from Karen Fletcher and the stolen thermal blankets. That's what I carry with me every day. And that's what I hope my children will carry forward into their own lives, long after I'm gone. The knowledge that they come from people who cared, who stood up, who believed that details matter and that community is worth fighting for. People who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is take the time to embroider a name into a blanket, just in case. Because you never know when that small act of care might change everything.